Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once more to Beverley Minster. I see lots of familiar faces from these lectures, but also a special welcome if this is the first one that you've attended. The lectures are free, but it does help us to get a donation, possibly £5 at the end. There's a plate at the back for you to do that. Marcus, who has done the most enormous amount of research into all sorts of obscure archives and publications, has given us over the last months and probably about a year now, an insight into all sorts of the highlights and indeed some of the lowlights, if you like, of the history of Beverley. But I suppose the one question that he hasn't actually addressed directly so far, which he will do tonight, is why Beverley at all? It wasn't a particularly encouraging place to come and make a settlement. Its original name, or as referred by Bede, is Inderawuda, which means in the woods of Deira. So an area, but also, of course, a very marshy area, as the old name Beverley indicates. So there are particular reasons why Beverley emerges. And indeed, if you like, I don't think I'm giving anything away that he won't mind me doing, and saying the reason that Beverley happens at all, the remains of the person that was responsible are literally buried a few feet behind us here. Right, okay. Is that all right? Is that all right? Right, okay. Normally you have to be very close to the microphone, but I've got a loud voice, so maybe that's why it's doing that. Okay, I'll turn it off and use my loud voice.
Well, good evening. Now, can you hear me okay? Good, right. So this microphone is working, but if it does give in, I will happily go, because I am old school, and just use my natural voice. Welcome on a warm, sultry evening to Beverley Minster for tonight's talk, From Marshland to Monastery, the beginnings of Beverley from 700. Ah, okay. I will switch it off. Well, we'll have a go and try, in case my voice goes halfway through, but if it doesn't.
Is that too loud now?
How is this? You can still hear me okay? Good, thank you. Right. Beverley is older than the Kingdom of England by at least 200 years. However, unlike its larger rival York, it can claim no Roman past, nor a place in the first 2 centuries of Anglo-Saxon occupation and settlement. But still, from circa 720, it can claim just over 1,300 years of continuous history. Now, the origins of the name do clearly lie in the stream or the lake of the beavers. We'll come to the Indorad a bit later on. This is a point reinforced not just etymologically, but that prior to Beverley being founded, the area was extensive marshland that included much of neighbouring Holderness, but at Beverley was at its wettest. Beverley, as you all know, owes its existence to the Bishop of York, St. John of Beverley, a kind, educated, pastoral, but reclusive, half-hermit saint who desired a life away from the world, and he founded a monastery in Beverley to retire to in 705, and it was there he died and was buried in 721. Now, the fact that Beverley began life as a monastery strongly reinforces the knowledge that nobody was then living there. Otherwise, it would have been a wholly unsuitable site for a monastic community desiring to withdraw itself from the sinful temptations and pressures exerted by the secular world, and it would be no place St. John of Beverley would have wanted to go. So, in spite of this, Beverley, which, as I began saying, and it's an important point to remember, is older than the Kingdom of England, which didn't come into existence until the early to mid-10th century. The beginnings of Beverley lie in the Kingdom of Northumbria. As a result of the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain after the Roman withdrawal, the country, as I'm sure you all know, was broken up into a large number of tiny local kingdoms, each with its own king or sub-king, some of whom were really little more than tribal chieftains, and the situation was chaotic. Eventually, 7 main kingdoms evolved, and smaller kingdoms were incorporated into these. The kingdoms, collectively known as the Heptarchy by 700 AD, the time of St. John of Beverley, were Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex, East Anglia, and Mercia and Northumbria. Northumbria was largely created from 2 kingdoms, the Kingdom of Deira, which focused and covered the East Riding of Yorkshire and parts of North Yorkshire, and Bernicia, which covered Northumberland and Durham. The 2 were formerly divided by the River Tees. And now, you should all have a handout, and on the handout, you do have initially 3 maps. Now, the first map just outlines, on the front of your handouts, the Kingdom of Northumbria in 700 AD. And you can see Deira, not the best reproduction, I'm afraid, there in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and then Bernicia above it. So this is the time of St. John of Beverley founding his monastery. And Deira and Bernicia have now united into Northumbria. If you turn over the page and look at the third map, you see England somewhat later, in 878 AD, when it's getting halfway towards unification. And you see there that Wessex and its dependencies are at the bottom. The Kingdom of Wessex has now taken over and subsumed the Kingdom of Kent and the Kingdom of Essex. The Kingdom of Guthrum has taken over East Anglia and parts of Mercia. Mercia, the Midlands, has divided into two, English Mercia and Danish Mercia. And then you see this thing called the Danelaw, coming from Northumbria right down to London, where Danish occupation and Danish settlement has established effective Danish rule. And now you see that Northumbria and York have actually divided. We'll come back to this later on, because later on the Kingdom of York, or the Kingdom of Jorvik, I'm sure many of you have been to the Jorvik Viking Centre, is basically the forerunner to Yorkshire. Its boundaries are the same. Why I particularly want to draw your attention to that third map is look in the top right-hand legend. At the bottom, it says swamp or alluvium. It's quite clear, if you look there, that Beverley is a swamp in 878, still by then. Surprisingly, large parts of Yorkshire are a swamp. Most of Ouse and Derwent today, as you can see to the left of the Beverley area, Pocklington, Home upon Spalding Moor, Selby, Howden, all that area will be a swamp as well. That's quite striking, and we do forget that. Holderness at this period actually isn't that much of a swamp, but it will become so later on. So, we'll return back to the handouts at the moment. Now, the situation remained far from stable throughout the greater part of the Anglo-Saxon period, certainly until the 10th century. And there was an unbroken succession of wars in which the various rulers sought to eclipse and dominate their neighbors. Kings who achieved overall dominance are remembered as the Bretwalda, or the ruler of Britain. And the first recorded Bretwalda was Ael of Sussex in circa 490. Next came Ceolwyn of Wessex, followed by Ethelbert of Kent in the 6th century. Northumbria dominated in the 7th century, Mercia in the 8th century, basically the English Midlands. And in 828, Egbert of Wessex was recognized as the most powerful Bretwalda to date. He was known as the overlord of the 7 kingdoms of the Heptarchy. And it is through this line that Alfred the Great of Wessex, by defeating the Danes, unites the kingdoms against a common enemy and emerges as a true national leader. And Alfred the Great's grandson, Athelstan, would rule from 924 to 927 as king of the Anglo-Saxons, and from 927 to 939 as the first king of the English. Very recently, just 2 to 3 years ago, Peter, could you pass me that book? I don't want to drop a microphone. Can you still hear me? Because my voice is going gravelly, isn't it? A very recent publication, and this is cutting-edge research, but the leading series, initially published by Methuen on the Kings of England, is the Yale University Press series of English monarchs. Sarah Foote, a friend of mine, only in 2011, it's only 14 years, has published the very first ever biography of King Athelstan. I strongly recommend it, available from all good bookshops. The first biography ever in history of King Athelstan, and it is a thumping good read. Can I give it back to you, Peter? I don't want to drop this microphone and break it. Can you pass me a glass of water as well? I'm getting gravelly. What I should do is I should give up smoking, shouldn't I? I really should. Now, the Venerable Bede who, as a friend, and was himself ordained a priest by St. John of Beverley, is regarded as the father of English history. And he describes St. John in his history. Bede is widely recognized as a very reliable source. So we are particularly, as historians, blessed in that, because it's unusual we get a contemporary eyewitness account of anybody in history, let alone a saint, who is as influential and powerful as Bede. So we can't really fault him. And he's an eyewitness account to some of his miracles. Bede tells us that St. John started out formally as a monk at Whitby, then he became Bishop of Hexham, and then became Bishop of York, a kind, pastoral, wise man whom performed miracles. But he preferred his own solitary company, praying and retreating to the woods and leading a semi-hermit life. Early on, during his time as Bishop of York, he immediately began to plan his own retirement and founded a monastery. An interesting thing about St. John of Beverley, even though he was Bishop of York, 10 years later, after his death, it will become the Archbishopric of York. And York is a febrile political minefield of jealous devotion between kings and archbishops and bishops. St. Wilfrid and Ripon really is not a very nice character. And St. John of Beverley is utterly fed up of it. He hates politics. He's planning his retirement from day one. He wants to get away from the court. He wants to get away from all these other church people. He doesn't really want to be a Bishop of York. He just wants to go off and be a hermit. And I think that's quite commendable and probably makes us warm to him. So he's planning his retirement from day one, and he founds a monastery, which according to Bede is known as Indara Wood, which means literally in the wood of Dera. And now known by most historians as actually in the wood of Beverley. Now Beverley is a marshland, but it does also have a wood. It's a swamp. Hence the association with beavers. Great place to build a dam, wouldn't you say? Now, he dies in 721 and was buried there. Curious reference in Bede's account. He's buried in the monastery Indara Wood, in St. Peter's porch in his own monastery. Now, we've never really quite worked out what the St. Peter's porch is about. And any ideas, I'd be interested to know. Now, due to the almost complete lack of evidence for the entire 8th and 9th century, we can only conjecture the fate of this monastery and the beginnings of Beverley. Beverley Monastery immediately acquired a sister monastery in the North Riding of Yorkshire at Ripon. Ripon Minster was founded by Irish monks in the 660s, refounded as a Benedictine monastery by St. Wilfrid, I mentioned before, who actually is the immediate successor to St. John of Beverley as Bishop of York. And Ripon Minster, Ripon Monastery, is founded in 672, so 30 to 50 years before Beverley. Mention must also be made of Whitby Abbey, founded in 657 by King Oswin of Northumbria and ruled from its beginning by the lady, later Saint Hilda. Whitby can be considered the premier Anglo-Saxon monastery of the north of England during its existence, even eclipsing York or Durham. It was here at 664, the famous Synod of Whitby settled the way of calculating the date of Easter along Roman rather than Iona or Celtic lines. And we've been bewildered ever since trying to work out when on earth Easter is, haven't we? But what seems to be one of those sort of rather seemingly pointless medieval debates, actually it's a really important subtext, which is happening here. I can think of other medieval examples. There was a long-standing debate between the Franciscans in the 13th century and the papacy about did Jesus own the clothes he wore? And everything hinged upon this. Some historians described it as about as worthwhile as debating how many angels can stand on the head of a pin. But actually, the subterfuge in these questions is quite huge. The question about did Jesus own the own clothes he wore is basically a question, is there such a thing as private property or not? Because if Jesus didn't own his own clothes, then there is no private property. The question about the date of Easter was basically, are we going to follow Rome and take authority from the papacy, or are we going to take authority from the Celtic Church in Scotland, from Iona Abbey, and from everywhere else? This is a critical power debate, and it changes the future of English Christianity because the Synod of Whitby votes in favor of Rome. Whitby, a curiosity of the Anglo-Saxon church, was a double monastery, housing both men and women religious, and it included St. John of Beverley, who started his time as a monk based at Whitby Abbey. Now, you might think I'm going off point. I'm not. I'm going to come back. Whitby Abbey was certainly laid waste and destroyed by successive Viking Danish raids between 867 and 870. The stunning Whitby Abbey you see today is a later Norman creation. Ripon Minster and Monastery were destroyed somewhat later in 948 by King Edred to reclaim the Viking kingdom of York or Jorvik back to English rule. This is going to get a bit complicated. I'm going to come back to that again because you've all been taught that actually Athelstan conquered Yorkshire and the kingdom of Jorvik, which he did, but actually after his death, it was lost again. Now finally, just to make you completely confused, we need to add Southwell Minster as a later sister church to both Beverley and Ripon. Now Southwell is in Nottinghamshire, which then, and indeed still, forms part of the province of York. I mean, it's still a bit of a debate amongst people of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire if they are northern or are they southern. Well, in a medieval world, they're definitely northern. Nottinghamshire is certainly was part of the Diocese of York and the province of York. And by the way, I hate to disappoint you, but actually, in the Robin Hood legends, there never ever was a sheriff of Nottingham. It was the sheriff of Nottinghamshire and the Forests who was a junior to the sheriff of York. And actually, it should really be the sheriff of York in those legends. Southwell Minster, anyway, is built in 956 by Oscytel, Archbishop of York, from 958 until his death in 971. Now, there appears to have been a general plan, or at least an aspiration, in the later Anglo-Saxon church that Beverley Minster would serve as the mother church of the East Riding. Ripon Minster would be the mother church of the North Riding, and Southwell would serve Nottinghamshire and southern Yorkshire, from pretty much modern Sheffield over to Pontefract, and the remainder would be covered by the Archbishop of York directly. A minster, of course, as I'm sure you all know, is a church, it's not a monastery. It is a church made up of non-monastic, that is secular priests, who lived together, whose job it was to go out and preach and teach in the surrounding countryside and found daughter churches in the various villages in the hope that eventually they would work themselves out of a job, they would convert the whole country to Christianity, start a parish system. And that's the end of the job. Then it would cease to be a minster. That is the historic term of the minster. It's a place of evangelism. And there are lots of places which retain the title minster and some which don't. Hull Minster is not a minster, it never has been. That is completely anachronistic. It's always been Holy Trinity Church. However, Pocklington Parish Church is very definitely a minster, and yet has never used the title minster. Minsters can be small, like Lastingham or Kirkdale in the North Yorkshire, or Beverley, or Howden, or York itself, York Minster. The most famous minster, of course, is in the south, I suppose, Westminster. Now, that's the job of the minster, and that is how Anglo-Saxon Christianity took hold in Yorkshire. The eventual completion of this plan would be that Beverley, Ripon, and Southwell would, after they'd done their job as a minster, would become cathedrals in their own right, not simply as a suffragan of York, but as a diocesan cathedral of the same status that we have diocesan cathedrals today. So they'd be part of the province of the Archbishop of York, overseen by him, but there would be the Bishop of Beverley, there would be the Bishop of Ripon, and there would be the Bishop of Southwell. But this, however, never came to fruition, possibly because, probably, due to the Norman conquest of 1066 and the rebellion and harrowing of the north in 1069 to 1070. Instead, two new, essentially Norman cathedrals took shape in northern England and displaced Beverley, Ripon, and Southwell. And these are, of course, Durham Cathedral, moved from Chester-le-Street and founded only in 995, with the current cathedral being built between 1093 and 1133, and Carlisle Cathedral, founded as a monastery in 1122 and created as a cathedral in 1133. Now this gives me one thing which might set the fox amongst some of the the Minster tour guides. It's about the thrift stool, the sanctuary so-called chair up there by the altar. I contend it is not a sanctuary chair. It has nothing to do whatsoever with the right of sanctuary, which I'll come on to later on in the talk. But actually, it is the prototype bishop's throne, the bishop's seat. And it has been brought here from elsewhere, probably in the early 9th. No, I've just gone wrong. Excuse me. It's probably brought here either from Hexham or from York by St. John as his bishop's seat. Remember, he's Bishop of York. He just founded this monastery, and he's brought the chair from York Minster with him to be Archbishop of York in Beverley, where he's going to retire to. And actually, it's from a different type of stone, from any other kind of stone in the Minster. I have mischievously suggested it would be great if we could work out some date to it. It has already got lots of schoolboy or choir boy graffiti over lots of it. Now, we can't do dendrochronology on a piece of stone. Architecturally, it is quite strange. It's quite different from everything. But if somebody one day were to come with a chippy thing, what am I saying? A chippy, what would you tell you, chipstone? A chisel, that's it. And were to accidentally break off part of it, just a little bit at the back, and we can blame it on the choir boys, and then take it off to a geologist to analyze at the University of York, we could at least work out, one, what kind of stone is it? Geologically, where can that stone be found? And at which geological strata can it be found? That might help us to a certain degree in actually dating it. And unless we do this, we're never going to know. Don't tell the vicar, he's on sabbatical. But, you know, if anybody's willing to take the plunge. Because it would be interesting to know, is it Roman? It may well be Roman. Because York Minster is built on the site of the Praetorium in York, the Roman governor's headquarters. Most of the foundations of the crypt of York Minster are Roman in date. There's a stonking great big Roman pillar next to it. There's the Multangular Tower in York, which is Roman. Constantine the Great was crowned emperor in York. There's a big statue of him. Constantine the Great is the first Christian Roman emperor in 314 AD. Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Septimus Severus, even before him, a Roman emperor, is proclaimed Roman emperor in York, the only African emperor. He also may well have been Christian. St. John of Beverley, who was very well educated, would have known this. And we do know the first reference we have to the existence of Christianity in the British Isles comes in 314 AD, 100 years before the Romans leave, when 3 English bishops attend the Council of Arles, A-R-L-E-S, in France. And we know that they are the Bishop of York, the Bishop of Londinium, and another unknown bishop, an area we can't identify, but may well be Cirencester. So the earliest reference we have to Christianity comes from York in the Roman period. And it's clear, if you've got 3 bishops going to a council in another country, the church is well established. It's been operating since at least the 2nd century. And so St. Alban may well be a real character. So I suspect the Frith stool up there is part of the first Christian Roman presence in York. And that's why St. John of Beverley may have brought it over here. Also, why do you need a chair for the whole sanctuary thing? I never quite got that. I mean, you know, do people go and sit on it in turn or something? Or you've got a queue? Is there somebody on the shift system sort of waiting, I'm going to be here all day in case somebody turns off and I've got to sit in this chair and they're going to claim sanctuary? It doesn't actually make sense. It must be quite a weird setup. So against this backdrop, we have to view the beginnings of Beverley. Prior to the arrival of the Vikings, initially raiding the coast of Yorkshire and Northumberland from 792, Northumbria was largely made up of Celtic and Romano-British villagers, with an increasingly but gradual settlement by Anglo-Saxons from modern-day Germany. North of the Humber, most of the Germanic settlers were Angles. South, they are Saxons. Now, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Deira, East Riding, up to the Tees, and Bernicia unite semi-permanently in 651. The arrival of the Vikings starts in 792, and then in 793, the following year, they sack and destroy Lindisfarne, which is an absolute disaster for the Anglo-Saxon church. From now on, it is on the back foot. And from the early 19th century, the Vikings begin to raid deeper and deeper into Northumbria and Yorkshire. So we're about to come to the third map on your handouts. Sorry, the second map on your handouts. The Great Heathen Army of 865. Initially, the Viking raids were sporadic, but then in 865, the greatest invasion since the Roman conquests of Julius Caesar and Claudius arrived in the form of the Great Heathen Army, which, as you can see, lands in East Anglia, down there in the bottom right of the map, and it began a sustained campaign of conquest. It quickly reached Thetford, and then Lincoln, and in 866, 867, it reached and struck at York, the city of York, twice in less than 1 year. The Northumbrians in the north, as so often, the bête noire was they were divided and fighting amongst themselves about who should become king, because it's not a natural progression from father to son. It's often who's the best warrior, really. And this is a bit disastrous. So the internal fighting and the fact that the Vikings are very, very good, it quickly results in the end of Deira and the Viking conquest of Yorkshire and the establishment of the Kingdom of York, or Jorvik, which lasts from 867 until 954, and as I've said, its boundaries are almost identical with ancient Deira and modern-day Yorkshire. You can see on the map. That's the Kingdom of Jorvik, but also it's Yorkshire, isn't it? You can tell. North Riding, East Riding, West Riding. Oops, sorry. My brother, older brother, who's a football player, well, he plays football. I hate football. He always used to tease me as a kid because he used to support Leeds United because he thought Leeds United was proper Yorkshire, and York wasn't, because York was far more interested in Vikings than it was interested in Yorkshire. They'd probably have a Viking as their mascot, whereas Leeds had the White Rose. I don't know why I thought about that at the time, but I just did. Now, initially, the Viking raiders are, of course, pagan, and they thought nothing of destroying and looting churches and monasteries. And it seems highly likely, almost certain, that St. John of Beverley's monastery was either destroyed by them or it was abandoned at this time. It would have been built out of wood, unlike Ripon, which we definitely know was built of stone, and whose original small stone crypt still survives. Certainly St. John and Beverley disappear from recorded history at this time. And also it is absolutely certain that no Anglo-Saxon monastery survived in all of Yorkshire at all by the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. Ripon is effectively gone, Southwell, even Whitby, Lindisfarne, Hexham, they have all gone. Janet Burton, who is the leading living historian of Northern monasticism, described Yorkshire in 1066 as a monastic desert. The first Norman monastery to be founded in Yorkshire was that of Selby Abbey in 1069 to 1070. Now, I'm going to backtrack a bit and go to Athelstan. So it's only with the rise of King Athelstan uniting England that we actually can really begin to pick up the story of Beverley. Athelstan rose as king of both Wessex and Mercia in 924 at the age of 30. But even then, he initially encountered resistance in Wessex for several months and was not crowned until September 1925. But in 2 years, in 927, he had conquered the last remaining Viking kingdom, that of Jorvik, or York, including Beverley. And it's possible then that actually he first heard of St. John of Beverley, whose cult was beginning to grow quite remarkably, and it will become a massive cult as the Middle Ages progresses, of international importance. But there's been a good 200-year gap between his death and Athelstan appearing on the scene. Athelstan, one of our most overlooked kings, largely because everybody remembers Alfred the Great because of something to do with burning cakes, and nobody knows who's Athelstan. But that's probably the state of education in our schools, unfortunately. Athelstan was the first Anglo-Saxon ruler of united England. And in 934, he invades Scotland and forces the king of the Scots, wonderfully called Constantine II, to submit to him as his liege lord and overlord. Athelstan's rule, however, is resented by both the Scots and the Vikings, who actually have conquered the kingdom of Yorkshire for nearly the better part of 60, 70 years by this period, so they've stopped raiding and pillaging. Now they've intermarried and settled down and started to become farmers. And actually they're becoming gradually Christian themselves, because they're half Viking by now. Their children are half Viking. There's much more Anglo-Saxons than there are Vikings. Their grandchildren are a quarter Viking. I don't think you can be anything after that, can you? You can't be an eighth something. After that, you become entirely something. I mean, I'm quarter Welsh because my grandmother was Welsh, but that Welshness won't pass down to my children. So the Vikings have gone native, but they resent Athelstan because he's a southerner from Wessex and Mercia, and they don't want to be ruled by him. So the Scots and the Vikings in north, including Yorkshire, form an alliance against Athelstan. And in 937, they invade England. Athelstan defeats them with a great victory at the Battle of Brunanburgh, an unknown location somewhere in northern England, The most recent plausible identification is somewhere on the Wirral Peninsula in modern-day Merseyside, but there's up to 40 different contenders for its location, including Numburn Home near Pocklington. Athelstan's victory, however, is decisive and consolidates his authority over England. But Athelstan dies 2 years later in 939. So that reunification of England is brief. It is only for 15 to 20 years, and the Vikings retake the kingdom of Jorvik and York, and they will hold on to it for the next 15 years under its last Viking king, I'm sure you've all heard of, the wonderfully named Eric Bloodaxe. That's a good Viking name, even if he has gone native. And Eric Bloodaxe is finally defeated and killed in battle in 954 by Athelstan's son, King Edmund I. Now, there are two legends linking St. John of Beverley with Athelstan. The first recorded by William Kettle in circa 1100, admittedly over 150 years later, but I'm going to read it out to you. And the second legend is particularly important, but this is the first. So this is a direct quote. When the most Christian King Athelstan, son of Edward the Elder, was on the throne, the surviving Danes, in accordance with their custom, raised their evil head against him, but they were trampled under his feet and reduced to dust. The Northumbrians and the Scots were rebelling against him, and they violated a treaty they had made with him. The king, having assembled a very large army, advanced by land and by sea, ready to subdue the wicked men. However, when he arrived in the province of Lindsey, that is North Lincolnshire, he met with a considerable crowd of poor and mean people. And when he asked them where they had come from, they replied, from Beverley, where they had gone to visit the relics of St. John in the hope of salvation. The king inquired if their prayers had been fulfilled, and one of them said, I, who was born blind, obtained the power of sight at the body of that holy man. And another said, I, who have been crippled from birth, as you see for yourself, am walking physically sound through the prayers of St. John. Hearing this and other similar stories, Athelstan said, that John of yours is a great man, and I believe it to be advantageous to win over the favor of such a man to us and obtain his assistance in subjugating the Scots. Therefore, in view of the fact that it is not the will of heaven that we pass by such a patron of our realm unvisited, let our army proceed on the king's highway, and I, together with a few companions, will undertake to visit his tomb in Beverley, about which I have heard so much, and to pray for his mercy. Then, when the king arrived at the tomb of the saint, after a solemn vigil of ancient custom, after prayers had been poured forth, in which he had drenched the pavement with his most devoted tears, having drawn his dagger out of his scabbard, he placed it on the sacred altar, saying, Behold, most blessed John, a guarantee of my solemn province, that if I return after successfully subduing the Scots, my enemies, with your help, I will redeem this dagger at a worthy price, and for as long as I live, I will prove to be grateful and devoted to you. The king then returned to his army and invaded Scotland with great force. And when the time to attack the Scots had arrived, after the king had fallen asleep on the preceding night, he saw St. John standing by him and encouraging him to fight fearlessly, saying, joyfully embracing your devotion which you demonstrated at my tomb, I have entreated my God on your behalf, and he has heard my voice. Therefore attend and hear my voice, so that you may walk in the ways of your fathers, and I shall be an enemy to your enemies, and I shall strike those who strike you, and the grace of God will protect you. It almost sounds like we're hearing the book of Genesis, isn't it? Or Exodus. You know, to Moses, I will be with you, and this is your promised land. It's that kind of language that's being used. Now, this probably isn't true, but we don't know. It probably is propaganda, but still, it is important, as I'm about to explain. When morning dawned, Athelstan attacked his enemies, and he achieved a great victory, and he forced the King of Scots to surrender. Then he explored the lie of the land and took the son of Constantine as hostage and returned to York. Making his way to Beverley from there, he redeemed his dagger by granting many gifts and the greatest liberties. Now, the second legend, dating from circa 1215, repeats this original legend, but with a very significant addition, which would have long-term consequences. And this is more to do with the future than the past. For as well as referring somewhat anachronistically to St. John of Beverley giving the banner of St. John to Athelstan to carry on his campaign against the Scots, and yet we don't get a reference until the banner of St. John until at earliest the 12th century, so that can't really be true. But there's a prophetic vision in this miracle of English mastery and overlordship over Scotland. And this will become vitally important later in the late 13th, early 14th century, when King Edward I Longshanks tries to subjugate Scotland, fighting John Balliol and Robert the Bruce, because this miracle is used again and again as propaganda and justification, even to the Pope in the court of Rome, to get Robert the Bruce excommunicated, which he largely is excommunicated on this evidence of St. John of Beverley telling Athelstan, actually now the Scots are your subjects. So Beverley therefore comes to play a significant role in poisoning medieval Anglo-Scottish relations for the next 200 to 300 years, and probably in football matches up to the present day. The miracle runs: returning via the seaways near Dunbar and seeing the overhanging crags, King Athelstan stood still and sighing, made this declaration: if God, through the intercession of St. John, were to undertake to make some clear sign to me, so that future generations, as well as those present, could know that Scotland has rightfully been made subject to the English, as they have been subjugated by Athelstan, and will pay tribute to English kings and successors for all time, I should not without good cause devotedly give thanks to him. And drawing his sword from its scabbard, he struck into the rock of Dunbar, overhanging on the North Sea, and you pass it actually on the train line up there, that wonderful train journey from Newcastle up to Berwick-upon-Tweed. And drawing his sword from its scabbard, he struck into the rock, which at that very hour was as capable of being pierced by the sword as if the stone were butter or yielding gravel. So the stone cut through as far as the sword thrust. And right up to the present day, that clear sign is visible, with a memorial showing clearly to everyone that the Scots were defeated by God and by the English. I'm quarter Scottish as well. I did my first degree at St Andrews, so I probably do apologise. When through divine intervention this sign was seen, we cannot count the numbers or expressions of thanks and praise that the king rose to God and St. John. He returns to England and he sets off immediately to Beverley and then prostrates himself in Beverley Minster, giving thanks to God and offering numerous gifts. And at this point, Athelstan creates the Peace of St. John, which is to be observed by everyone. Now, this is the sanctuary bit. Now, finally, the sanctuary chair, which actually I still think is the bishop's chair, might be serving some purpose, because the Scots have been subjected, now English murderers and criminals are going to be set free if they get to Beverley Minster by claiming sanctuary. Because Athelstan grants that the Peace of St. John to be observed by everyone, and it would not be permitted to anyone of whatever rank or position to infringe it for any reason at any time. He assigns a radius of 1 mile in respect of this peace, which had to be observed, and the limit as far as an enormous thorn bush situated in Molescroft on the road which leads to York, where a new stone cross was erected, so that anyone who violated this peace, so anyone who's broken the law, committed any crime, from petty theft to slander up to murder, or trying to escape a financial debt, or somebody who's a traitor, by claiming the peace or sanctuary, it means that you will be held innocent for a period, and you will have the chance of escape. We can talk about sanctuary later on, but that's the basic idea. It's mercy taken to the absolute extreme. It's quite good if you're trying to escape a debt, and also if you were wrongly accused or something like that. It's a bit unfortunate that you're also allowing a whole load of homicidal mass murderers into your time as well, who really aren't sorry at all, and you're going to let them still have weapons and stuff. But anyway, that's a by the by. Now, there are various fines set out if anybody interferes and doesn't allow people. And if you stop anybody once they're past the thorn bush or the crosses, you have to pay £8 of silver to the Church of Beverley Minster as a fine. £8 of silver is a heck of a lot of money. If you get within 500 yards effectively of Beverley Minster and you're stopped, the person who stops you has to pay £24 of silver to Beverley Minster. If the person gets to the cemetery, the churchyard, and somebody stops them, then the person who stops them is compelled to give £72 of silver as a penance. And if somebody tries to stop somebody inside Beverley Minster, then that sum is tripled. This is a good money earner. I bet the canons in Beverley Minster must sometimes be sort of hoping, go on, horrible person, take him and then we can find you lots of money. Also, as well as the Peace of St. John, then we get this other gift, was King Athelstan gives various revenues for the maintenance of the clergy of Beverley Minster, so they may devote themselves freely to God, which is basically every year the farmers of East Yorkshire had to pay to the king's officials corn of the finest quality, which was demanded for the fodder of the king's horses, namely 4 fraves. A frave is equivalent to 1.5 bushels from their crops, and it is from all of East Yorkshire on today's modern boundaries. Every single parish. This is a fantastic amount of food and corn. It becomes a really controversial fact later on in the Middle Ages as various other churches try to get out of this and complain that it's an unfair demand because they're having to pay taxes and what is almost 10% of their harvest to Beverley Minster, on top of the 10% they've got to pay to their own local vicar. And then they've still got to find something to live on. And then we can start to actually understand how Beverley Minster gets built. This incredibly wealthy thing. It's still a bit of a puzzle to me, how they pay for this in the 14th century, but the fraves must be a big part of it. Now, although no original charters of Athelstan survive, and Beverley Minster becomes remarkably good at forging documents, because it gets a reputation for forging stuff, because it's lost all the Athelstan stuff, as I'll explain in a bit. So it has to recreate them. And some bits are genuine, like the sanctuary thing, and some other bits aren't so genuine. So the vicars of Beverley Minster, the provost, claim to be a coroner. They claim to have their own gallows. They claim to have their own prison and jail, because it's been granted to them. They forget to sort of look that actually they're claiming to be a coroner nearly 100 years before the office of coroner has ever been created, which kind of makes it a bit dodgy. but Beverley has a reputation for this. And whether it's deliberate or not is very unclear, because it probably genuinely thinks it does have this right. Because the borough and liberties of Beverley, the king's officials aren't allowed to go in. And it doesn't pay taxes. And for a long period, it doesn't even have to actually provide anybody for war. It does become something of a spiritual republic, a province in its own right. You could say Beverley, the liberties and borough of Beverley, which includes Tickton, Molescroft, Woodmansey, is Beverley Shire. That wouldn't be an unfair term. Beverley's earliest charter is that given to it, not by the king, but by the Archbishop Thurston of York, who happens to own Beverley and is actually the chief of this shire. And it's 1122, and it gives the town, makes the town of Beverley a borough, clearly, with an extended fair, and allows it to be administered by 12 keepers, which it can elect. It grants it a guild hall and the right for it to pass its own bylaws. Athelstan is referred to at various times in documents from the time of William Conqueror, in terms of that he endowed Beverley, but we don't have any clear evidence of what rights he gave it to them. Now, the beginnings of Beverley and Minster, probably I haven't dealt with clearly in the whole Athelstan thing, was, we presume, what replaced St. John of Beverley's monastery at some point in this period. Because how could Athelstan have done all this if the monastery of Beverley has been destroyed by the Vikings 50 to 60 years before, or abandoned by them? And it's a marshland still. The town doesn't exist. This is the bit that starts to become very, very problematic. And we are very much dependent on Bede here. So the miracle accounts clearly contain some truth. What we're told in them, there isn't actually, although Athelstan meets these poor people on the way up, who say they've been to Beverley, these are people from Lincolnshire, North Lincolnshire, and they've come home. They're not people from Beverley. In fact, Athelstan, and on his records, we never meet any people from Beverley. Is there anybody there? Literally. And yet something must have happened, because Athelstan wouldn't have gone there otherwise. Could it be all that's referred to is the tomb or the shrine of St. John in the wood, in the marsh, in Dera? Possibly, could it be that this is like a modern folly that you get in a stately home of the 18th century? Or that you get at Sledmere House, or that is, or an island like Princess Diana is buried on Allthorpe with a sort of chapel there. That's where the tomb of St. John, that's all that remains of the monastery. And it was probably later built on the site of the monastery simply to ensure that the location of the remains of St. John were never forgotten. It seems unlikely that any town or settlement of Beverley could have existed. As I said, there isn't enough there. Now, Beverley does certainly emerge as a town in the first half of the 11th century, in 1000 to 1066. The last three Anglo-Saxon archbishops of York in the early 12th century are primarily responsible for the development of Beverley as a town and a trading community. And they develop and promote a church which somehow was coming to existence as a minster, a secular community of priests who have gathered around. The marshes are now being drained some point between Athelstan and between 1000 AD, which is only 3 generations. So at some point here, a evangelistic monastic sort of community, presumably after the final defeat of Eric Bloodaxe in 954, has happened, that this Minster community develops. Now, these last 3 Anglo-Saxon archbishops of York, they're now archbishops of York, Aelfric, who had been Dean of Winchester, start to build a serious big stone Norman church with a communal chapter house, a refectory, a dormitory. They redecorate it. They put in a new pulpit of gold and silver or bronze. They commission lives of St. John of Beverley by Fulcard. And they do the same with Ripon and with Southwell. They try to reform the secular priests of Beverley in particular by ensuring that they were to avoid the company of women, that they were to sing services together in the chapel, and they were to eat together in a common refectory. But most importantly, Archbishop Aelfric, through the petition of the Pope, finally achieves the official canonization of St. John of Beverley as a saint in 1037 and builds a magnificent new shrine of gold, silver, and precious stones. And this undoubtedly would have placed Beverley firmly on the pilgrimage map. But it's taken this long, 3.5 centuries, 3 centuries after his death, for St. John of Beverley to actually be officially canonized as a saint. And that is interesting. Now, the building of this church, this large stone church, clearly took several generations, from 1000 right up until the Norman conquest. And so throughout this period, that former marshland which now been drained and the wood which has now almost certainly been cut down to pay for the roof and all sorts of things, Beverley must have become something of a building site, or taking on the form of it, as well as stonemasons, labourers, carpenters, glaziers, plumbers, blacksmiths, carriers and wheelwrights, and all the ancillary occupations required to feed, clothe and support both the people building this new Beverley Minster, but also the growing number of pilgrims coming to the newly canonised Saint Shrine formed the nucleus of the emerging commercial life of Beverley. And the creation of Beverley Beck, which is deliberately canalised, turned into a canal about 600-700 years before other canals are built, is done by the Archbishop of York deliberately in order for stone to be transported from Tadcaster and Sherburn and Elmet down the River Aire, Calder and Ouse, River Humber, River Hull and up to Beverley Beck for the building of the Minster. And in doing so, creates in Beverley Beck quaysides, wharfs and cranes for the creation of an inland port, which would begin trading the export of wool later on from the Minster's estates on the Wolds with continental Europe, and enable Beverley to trade extensively with the emerging Hanseatic League of ports throughout northern Europe. Now, I'm moving towards the end of my talk, you'll be glad. I'm going to go just about 5 minutes over, just to bring it up to the end of the 12th century. The most famous date in English history, you all know, of course, is 1066. And the battles of the much overlooked Stamford Bridge, where I grew up as a child, is just up the road. And Hastings, of course, further south, are both well known. By Christmas Day, William of Normandy was crowned King of England, and the Anglo-Saxon earls and their bishops found themselves rapidly being replaced by Normans. And this will finally kill off any idea of Beverley becoming a cathedral. Anglo-Saxon culture was openly attacked by the new Norman masters. Often forgotten, but the Normans themselves were not originally from Normandy in France. They were originally called the Northmen, which originally was the Norsemen. Basically, they were the descendant of the Vikings. How interesting. We've come full circle. But the Norsemen are the Norwegians, who then colonized Normandy as well as England. So history strangely repeated itself. The Kingdom of England is like it even bigger. You could say the Kingdom of York finally wins out to Jorvik in a strange way. However, they think that they're quite posh, civilized Vikings, the Normans. They don't treat the Anglo-Saxons very well at all. They do actually enslave some of them. Victory at Hastings in 1066 and coronation of Westminster Abbey didn't mean that England had been conquered. It just meant that William Conqueror had won a battle, killed Harold Godwinson, and become a king. Anywhere else outside of southeast England, which still arrogantly seems to think it is England, everybody else said, well, it didn't affect them, and certainly not in Yorkshire. So, in 1068, Earl Morcar of Northumbria still has earls, doesn't have kings, rises up in open rebellion against William the Conqueror. And in 1069, he forms an alliance with Denmark, and a Danish fleet sails into the River Humber to assist the Northumbrians against their Norman oppressors. William the Conqueror is forced to march north with his army, and in 1069 to 1070 carried out what has been termed the harrying of the North. York, the city, was destroyed, and the majority of Yorkshire was quite literally laid waste. Historians have estimated at least 100,000 were killed, and has been described by both modern historians today and contemporary chroniclers of the period as a genocide, as an ethnic cleansing of non-Norman, a wholesale, indiscriminate massacre. Few parts of Yorkshire were spared, but for some reason Beverley was, and we know this for absolute certain. It's confirmed by the Domesday Book entry, which compared the value of estates in 1086 with what they were in 1066 before the harrowing of the North, not before the Norman conquest. And there is no evidence of Beverley being damaged or laid waste at all, even though all the places around it are. Even the immediate surrounding villages, Walkington, Cherry Burton, Poppington, Driffield are larger, but Beverley isn't. Now it does beg the question, why? Why? In fact, its revenues in Domesday Book are still not taxed. Beverley appears to have been continuing 26 years after the harrying north, as a prosperous concern, with 3 mills of 13 shillings annual value, 6 ploughs, pasturable woodland 3 leagues in length and 1.5 in breadth, and a fishery of 7,000 eels. That would be doing pretty well today if you had 7,000 eels. If you open that on the trout streams at Driffield, they were making big business. The average village has only got 100 to 200 people. 7,000 eels. We do the maths. That must be, eel for breakfast, dinner, and lunch every day for years. Now, the miracle writers of the Minster community ascribe Beverley's survival to the protection of St. John and an example of his miraculous power beyond the grave. Whatever the real or precise cause, it must have been out of respect to the cult of St. John of Beverley, which had spread to Brittany and France, that stayed William the Conqueror's hand. And he may well have heard of St. John of Beverley from Normandy, it's next to Brittany. And in doing so, gave Beverley a benefit that very few of its neighbours had, a prosperous future. Now, I really am going to wind up in this last bit, because this is quite a juicy bit, and I've already cut out fair bits, but I'm going to jump towards the end of the at the Norman period. Beverley and the anarchy of King Stephen and Maud. The reign of King Stephen of England from 1135 to 1154 has been variously described as the anarchy, the First Norman Civil War, the 19 long winters. England, throughout the entire reign of Stephen, was engulfed in the most bitter of power struggles with 2 contenders to the crown, both with very powerful claims. This is the background to The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, or to the brother Cadfael Chronicles by Ellis Peters. Henry I, King of England, had died in 1135 with only a daughter, Maud, known as Matilda, to succeed him. His only son had drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. Stephen was the nephew of King Henry and the nearest male descendant. He was also backed by the church, and he seized the throne immediately by having himself crowned in Westminster within days of Henry's death, whilst Matilda was still in France. Now, during this very confusing period of English history, during which right up until the end, the country was torn half in half between supporters of the king, Stephen, or the empress, known as Maud or Matilda, in which the nobility frequently changed sides multiple times dependent upon who was winning, dependent upon the winds and the seasons. Beverley and Yorkshire, initially reluctant to support Stephen, largely came over to Stephen's side, though not out of any close loyalty, but rather out of a great fear of the past. And for this, they might have cursed Athelstan, rather than have been pleased with him, because they were terrified with one of the greatest kings Scotland was ever to produce. A biography here, King David I. King David I was able to conquer all of Cumbria, all of Northumberland, including Carlisle and Newcastle, besiege Durham, take substantial parts of western Yorkshire as far south as Skipton, and intended absolutely to take York and to take Beverley. King David was nominally allied to the Empress Maud, but he was nothing else but an opportunist, and a very clever one. And he did have a valid claim on the former earldom of Northumbria, and he saw the Britain was south of the Humber, English, north of the Humber, Scotland. And he came damn well close to succeeding. Almost all of the Yorkshire clerical writers claimed that St. John of Beverley was the only person who could save them against King David. King David invades Yorkshire. He fights a huge battle, the Battle of the Standard between Thirsk and Northallerton. And this is the first reference that comes to the banner of St. John in 1138, when it's used by Archbishop Thurston of York to try to defeat the Scots, because King Stephen is too busy trying to fight off Maud in the south. Now, although David is actually defeated at the Battle of the Standard, it's a weird thing. He wins the peace. Because although the Yorkshire barons and Archbishop Thurston do defeat him on the battlefield, Stephen is forced to cede so many earldoms and Carlisle permanently and much of Cumbria to Scotland, because he can't afford another battle in the north and still fight Maud in the south. So it's one of those sort of strange things. You know, you lost the battle, but you won the war. I remember there was that question sometimes asked in O-level papers. I was the last person to do O-level. Britain won the war during the Second World War, but lost the peace. Discuss. This is the other way around. Now, Stephen is eventually able, at the very end of his reign, comes to a stalemate draw. And although Beverley is part on his side, Beverley is actually hedging its bets here. And Stephen has to heavily fine Beverley for harbouring supporters of the Empress, including the Archbishop of York, Henry Murdoch, who dies in Beverley and goes over to stay in Beverley against Stephen's wishes. Stephen actually comes up and actually contemplates actually destroying Beverley, and even starts building a castle in Beverley. There was a castle in Beverley, but was apparently dissuaded by the intervention in a vision of St. John of Beverley. It's also possible that he was called south to fight Maud and was unable to devote any resources to the completion of his castle construction. Now my conclusion. In 1188, a devastating fire spread throughout Beverley, destroying both the Minster and the town, including the Archbishop Manor. Rebuilding work quickly began, replacing the old Norman church with the current Minster that we see today, an architectural masterpiece of the early English 13th century architecture in the choir and the decorated 14th century nave. Symbolically, the Normans, kings, were finally becoming English themselves. In turn, the reason we are great, because eventually everybody goes native. After King Stephen's death in 1154, still unable to defeat Maud, he accepts her son as his successor to bring the anarchy to an end. And so Henry II succeeds as king, the Lion in Winter. And he takes on a new name. He was the first Plantagenet king, the dynasty that would rule throughout medieval England until the accession of the Tudors in 1485. Beverley would reach its golden age throughout the course of the 14th century, but its foundations lay in the 11th, 12th, and 13th, a period during which the cult of St. John spared the town from more than one catastrophe and enabled its freemen and clergy to prosper, either because of his miracles or simply due to his reputation. Beverley owes St. John an immeasurable depth of gratitude. And therein I end my talk. Thank you. Okay.
I can avoid kicking the water over.
Oh, sorry. No, not yet. And I must admit, that was quite a recent discovery on my part. But, oh, whoa, whoa, whoa.
That was going to go sooner or later.
There has been some wonder if it was actually in Cottingham, because one of the miracle accounts do talk about St. John of Beverley rescuing a follower of Maud from Cottingham Castle to Beverley. Of course, Cottingham is just nearby, so it could have been in between Cottingham and Beverley. No, it's not.
It's not.
It's dedicated to St. John the Evangelist and St. Martin of Tours, who's from France.
It's confusing, I agree, yes.
Are there any churches dedicated specifically to
Yes.
John of Beverley?
Well, a very good question. Do you know, I don't know. There are. Yeah, I suppose Harpham.
Yeah, which is Harpham, which of course is where John was supposed to have been born.
Yeah.
But there are other ones, and I've seen references, but I can't remember where they are now.
Yeah.
Can you?
No, I can't, and that's
No,
worth
but
looking
there
into.
are.
Thank you, that's a really good question. I'm going to have to come back to you on that. Oh, yes.
Yes,
In Beverley, yeah. I assumed...
Because the Bishop of Yorkshire, during the first, during the time after the Reformation, there were 4 apostolic visitors who were speaking with them. It was all very hush-hush. But latterly, he was based in Beverley and was the apostolic visitor for the whole of Yorkshire.
Right.
Based in Beverley.
In Beverley. That's why it is. But of course, that's a Victorian church. Now, as medieval churches, trying to look at the medieval cult, one thing that's been very interesting in research is that we're dedicated to St. John the Evangelist, the guy who wrote the Fourth Gospel and probably the Book of Revelation. There's also dedicated equally to St. Martin of Tours, because at the back of the church, by the font, that was St. Martin's church. You're actually in the parish of St. Martin. And it's St. Martin of Tours who's the patron saint of France. And there are about 40 medieval churches dedicated to St. Martin, several around here, Fangfoss, near Pocklington, Yapham, near Pocklington. There's a St. Martin Cum Gregory on Micklegate in York. And St. Martin and St. John of Beverley are very similar saints. I've been researching into the history of St. Martin and trying to trace those churches, but I haven't, daft I am, actually, I haven't yet identified, apart from Harpham, any medieval churches which are St. John of Beverley.
Sorry, quick. Right.
Oh yes, in Brittany. Yes, there is. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the cult of St. John of Beverley was very big in Brittany. It does become international. But it's still a curiosity why there aren't any medieval churches dedicated to him in England. We're going to have to look into that.
I've just checked. Actually, Harpham is St. John's.
Is it? Oh.
Yeah, I've just Googled it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Where?
Say thank you very much, Marcus. I really enjoyed that. One thing I was really intrigued by was when you talked about William's harrying of the north and Beverley being spared. And is there? It seemed fascinating. That was it. Just do you think it talked about the mystical power of St. John? Might that have been, as you say, just a sort of superstitious dread of what happened? Or is there any evidence of, it doesn't sound like there could have been enough resource to spare or anything like that. So,
Interesting question. In spite of all the horrors that were formed in the Middle Ages, we must never forget this is an age of faith. This is a profoundly, Christian society which is aware about its judgment. Destroying, looting a saint's shrine is a big deal, even for a king. And he would have had a personal sort of mortification for it. But also politically, this is not good. He's going to have to still, at some point, try to govern and re-establish authority over Yorkshire. And he probably needs Beverley, in some respects, to do that, or at least one centre. And Beverley was seen as the mother church of the East Riding. So there could be very good political reasons that William Comber thinks this is a step too far. I've already made an example by destroying and terrorising the villages, but I'm going to leave Beverley Minster. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make very sure I control who is the provost of Beverley Minster and who is the Archbishop of York, and I'll do it that way. So I suspect that might be the reason.
I think as well you will find a parallel to what Marcus just said if you think of the enormous lengths which Henry II went to atone for the murder of Thomas Becket. Again, superstition. Obviously it was partly political again, But, I mean, I think there was a genuine sense of, oh my God, what have I done? You know, a need to atone in a fairly big way. Yes, I saw a hand up.
Has there ever been any exhumation of bones? Do we know definitely there?
Yeah, I mean, they were last dug up in 1664, and they found bits of them and some beads and stuff, and a inscription that there was a fire here in 1188, and they were moved and translated. So yes, and actually interesting that old sort of sign, 1188, which probably referred to them being, because they were translated, they were moved by Edward I in 1295 to an even bigger shrine, as a result of St. John of Beverley giving him victory over the Scots, Robert the Bruce, and they were exhumed then. St. John becomes a patron saint of England, because after the Battle of Agincourt, it's not St. Crispin, St. Crispianus that does it, it's St. John of Beverley's feast day that King Henry V attributes his victory to. So they have been dug up a couple of times. Last time was 1664. But I mean, there's not much of them. There's bits of him. I don't think there's a skull. There's just some bits of ribs and thigh bones that were discovered. I don't think there've been any. They weren't dug up in 1730s, were they?
No, they were actually found. You probably know that the great architect Hawksmoor, great Baroque architect who incidentally put towers on Westminster Abbey, did a lot of work here. There isn't much left. The west doors are, and those statues are, and also the sort of the screen, the wrought iron screen down that side aisle. But it's said that he was responsible for sort of raising the old floor and redoing the floor, and it was then that the relics were discovered. And there was apparently a small, not a full-size coffin, but a lead box with an inscription on it. And again, I mean, how did it survive? Well, it's the same conundrum as to why so much medieval sculpture and everything survives in Beverley Minster through the Reformation. And it may well have been the power and the influence of the Percy family which may have got those relics out in time, or simply the remoteness of Beverley at that time, that they got news of what was happening further south, and they simply got John's relics out of the elaborate shrine and buried safely away.
The tricky bit, though, in all of this, I mean, they probably are. I mean, I think you now need an order from the Home Office to exhume a grave for historical reasons to dig it up and do a DNA test, which, well, if you could, you could do a dating test. There's that unfortunate period, always remain rather unfortunate, between the destruction of the monastery by the Vikings in 867 and Athelstan and founding the Minster Church. There's that blank of 90 years in which what happened to the bones of St. John. It's by default we assume that he's in this shrine in the middle of nowhere. That's the tricky bit.
Okay. One final comment on your bit about the English and the Scots. There was an interview on Radio 4 only about 6 months ago with a Scottish general, retired Scottish general. Couldn't have said it if he was serving. And apparently they're having some problems recruiting for the Scottish regiments. And he said, frankly, the only way I think we'll increase recruiting for Scottish regiments is giving them a realistic hope of fighting the English.
Good. Before we finish, I want to draw your attention to the last bit of your handout, which actually is the majority part of your handout. So look past the maps. It says St. Mary's Church, a confirmation of extensive grants in 1329. And this, I spent ages doing this. I'm going to have at least a minute on it. I've typed out 8 pages here from original medieval summaries of the Latin documents. Now, St. Mary's Church, of course, we forget about, because even though it's wonderful and beautiful, built circa 1150. This is a list in 1329 of King Edward III of confirming all its grants in mortmain, that's the dead hand, of lands and rents in Beverley for the fabric of the Church of St. Mary in that town. And it mentions names, occupations, streets, and places in Beverley, normally for the first time ever, with extra details of the interior and usage of the Church of St. Mary, and details about its condition. It is astonishing how wealthy St. Mary's Church is in. I mean, do take that home and read through. You have over 150, 200 different shops, houses, grants, orchards, bits of land. And it includes some of the first references to the buttermark and everything else. And it shows how wealthy St. Mary's Church becomes in the course of the 12th, 13th century, let alone the Minster.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to Daniela again for playing for us.